the motherfucking morning to you, my friends. Welcome one, welcome all to my podcast, Alexandra Unfiltered, a show where we hypothesize, theorize, and analyze all about women's rights, women's wrongs, and everything in between. I am your gracious host, Alexandra Rose, a bad bee with a law degree, simply doing what I do best. Ranting, raving, whining, and complaining. And not necessarily in that order. I'm so excited you've joined me today, and I'd like to wish everyone a very belated Happy New Year. It's been over a month since you guys have heard from me, which I apologize for, honestly. I needed some time off. I'm not going to lie to you. Content creation is no joke, because for starters, unlike other podcast hosts, I am gainfully employed, all right? I have a day job. I have a 9-to-5. So content creation is my passion project. And in addition to my passion project and my 9-to-5, I also freelance as a grant writer, a web designer, and a social media manager. So there's a lot going on. I needed the time off, and I wanted to make sure I could come back in full swing, ready to knock down the patriarchal pillars that keep us in chains as women and as LGBTQ they-them members, right? So thank you so much for joining today, and thank you for being patient with me as I went on my little hiatus. Today's episode, I have some really good content to talk with you today, because today I'm going to be presenting a theory that I have created, a theory that I have come up with. And I want to talk about the impact of class on a woman's reproductive decisions. Allow me to lay the groundwork so that we are all on the same page in terms of the kind of language and verbiage that I will be using today. So I'm saying a woman for the purposes of this discussion. I'm specifically referring to heterosexual cisgender women. That's my default definition that I'm using today. And I'm using that definition because I do not want to speak over the voices of women who are not cisgender heterosexual women. That's my primary motivation. It's not for lack of inclusivity. It's not arising out of a desire to exclude certain women. Rather, it's being clear on the women that I'm specifically addressing when I'm putting forth my theory about how class impacts a woman's reproductive decisions, okay? And I'm specifically also speaking to heterosexual cisgender women who are fertile, for lack of a better phrase. I know that's kind of a somewhat outdated phrase when you're not using it in particular medical circles, but when I say fertile, I'm speaking to women who menstruate and who have the ability to have children. So for the purposes of this discussion, women who may want to get pregnant one day, or women who, when they procreate or when they lay down with a cisgender heterosexual man, run the risk of becoming pregnant with a fetus that then develops into an infant, so on and so forth, just so that we're all on the same page. So what does that academic mumbo jumbo mean for everyone present? That simply means I'm defaulting here to straight women who menstruate, basically, when I'm having this discussion about the impact of class on a woman's reproductive decisions. All right, so let's just get into it. Let's dive right in. So on my TikTok page, also shameless plug, please do follow me on TikTok now that it's back, I guess, kind of for the time being. Alex Rose M, as in Mary had a little lamb _ on TikTok. On TikTok, I've started a new little series where my theory is that class is a greater indicator and has a greater impact on a woman's reproductive decisions than any other standalone factor, including but not limited to a woman's race, a woman's religion, a woman's ethnicity, a woman's geographic location, etc. So it's my theory that class really is what determines a woman's approach to exercising reproductive decisions, okay? I'm going to give you my definition of class that I'm using, but I'm also going to give you some scholarly definitions of class as well, because at my core, before I was a bad bee with a law degree, I was a bad bee getting my sociology degree from Michigan State University. Go Green, home of the Spartans. All right, so class, as defined by Karl Marx, a German sociologist and economist, he stated that class was defined by one's relationship to the means of production. Karl Marx's understanding of class in a modern capitalist society, such as the society we live in here in the United States, is that the proletariat, which is everyone who's not rich, the proletariat work, but do not own the means of production, and the bourgeoisie, aka the very wealthy, rich people, invest in and live off of the surplus generated by the proletariat's operation of the means of production, but do not work at all. So what does that mean? That means that Karl Marx defined class basically in relation to whether or not you were someone who has to work for a living, or whether or not you're someone who lives off of the work that other people have to do for a living, essentially. So the wealthy, the bourgeoisie, versus the proletariat, who are the non-wealthy, which are us down here at the bottom, the workers. Essentially, how I view it, with Karl Marx's definition, how I view it is that if you are someone who has to pay attention to the price of gas, then you are a proletariat. You are someone who has to work for a living. If you have to focus on the price of gas, if the price of gas is something you have to take into consideration when purchasing a vehicle, or the price of gas is something you have to take into consideration for your when you're doing your weekly budget and things like that, and your monthly budget and your bi-weekly budgeting, if the price of gas is something you have to focus and worry about, then you are not a member of the upper class. You are not a member of the bourgeoisie. You are a proletariat. That's Alexandra Rose's definition, that the price of gas is the calling card, the indicator, if you will, right? So that's Karl Marx's definition. His definition is very much black and white in terms of what class is, right? So either you're a proletariat worker, or you're a bourgeoisie wealthy person who lives off of the work done by the proletariat, okay? Another very not wealthy, but very well-known sociologist who basically established sociology as we know it, another German man, Max Weber, contrasted Karl Marx's view. Max Weber stated that class is determined by economic position with social status, and that is determined by social prestige rather than just the means of production. Okay, so Max Weber's definition is a little more in line with the definition that I'm going to give you guys, that I'm using for the purposes of my theory on this episode. Max Weber is basically saying your position in the hierarchy of certain class statuses is more so what determines your class, rather than you either being a worker or being a member of the bourgeoisie, right? So those are some noted sociologists' definitions of class. Alexandra Rose's definitions of class, for the purposes of this episode, are a little different. When I am positing the theory that class is has a greater impact on a woman's reproductive decisions than any other standalone factor, the definition of class that I am using is the social values, the beliefs, the mores that a person was socialized to believe in their upbringing, the impact of a person's social setting and their surroundings, and how that shapes their worldview, how that shapes their view of themselves, and specifically how that person's values and beliefs that are implanted into them in their upbringing shapes how they view their ability to exercise individual power, agency, and autonomy. So what I am saying here is that class is not necessarily marked by income or education or geographic location, like your zip code, for example. The definition I'm using is a little bit more flexible, and that's impacted by the fact that I live here in the United States, where class is not as rigid, in that you don't have to be born into a particular social class in order to achieve that social class. Here in the United States, if you're born, generally speaking, right, if you're born poor, then through the means of obtaining an education or obtaining a particular skill or a license or a certificate or something, you can transition into a higher income and transition into a higher class. So it's not as rigid as it is in other places. We have relatively fluid class mobility here in the States, right? So My definition of class then mimics or mirrors that fluidity that exists here in the United States, in that class is it's the set of beliefs and values that a person, or particularly a woman, are socialized to have in her upbringing, specifically the developmental years. So birth to, I'm going to say adolescence. Honestly, late adolescence, right? So 0 to 19 years old. The beliefs and the values that are instilled in that woman that impact how she views herself and impact how and whether or not she believes she can exercise certain agency and autonomy in making reproductive decisions, okay? So with that in mind then, I think that class is a bigger factor in determining a woman's reproductive decision-making process is because I've observed certain phenomena. I have observed women of all social incomes, regardless of race and regardless of what social strata they're born into. I've observed, and I think you have too, women who will reach adulthood. And by the time they've reached adulthood, they now occupy a particular class by virtue of their profession, by virtue of the fact that they're college educated, by virtue of the zip code that they live in. They occupy a particular class. And yet and still, when that woman encounters something like an unwanted pregnancy, rather than approaching that unwanted pregnancy through the lens of the class she currently occupies, which is based on her income, she approaches that unwanted pregnancy through the lens of the class in which she was socialized in her upbringing. So in other words, this is my theory that I think explains why professional women who are college educated, like high earning and work in very professional, very formal corporate spaces that you typically have to be very educated and very skilled to work in. This is my theory that I think explains why those women still end up with bummy loser men, and still end up procreating with those men. Because it boils down to the fact that although those women may earn a certain amount, and that puts them in a certain income tax bracket, and although those women have formal college education, a bachelor's degree plus 1 or 2 or 3 or more graduate degrees or even professional degrees, right? She's not making decisions, especially reproductive decisions, that align with the class she currently occupies. If you're looking at class as just a measure of income, she's making decisions, reproductive decisions specifically, based on the class that she was socialized in her upbringing, in her developmental years, right? So within that then, I have observed that women who are socialized a particular way treat reproductive decisions and things like birth control and abortion and abstinence. They treat those things as though they have this sort of resigned attitude to this. And I've said this in my TikTok too. But they approach unwanted pregnancy as something that they have no control over. If you notice some of the language that they use when you sit down and talk with certain women, like, you didn't even have to get pregnant. Why weren't you on birth control if you kind of weren't expecting to have children, but you were having sex with someone and, you weren't on birth control. You weren't making their partner use condoms. You don't believe in abortion or a woman's right to choose. What was going on? What was the thought process there? You're college educated. Why weren't these things being taken advantage of? And you notice that her reaction is sort of one of, well, it is what it is. Every woman eventually gets pregnant, and it's just, I guess I just have to have this baby, even though I'm not ready to be a mom, even though my career is just in its infancy, even though I don't really have the resources or the support system to bring a child into this world. I guess I'll just have this baby. That's their kind of, the kind of resigned attitude that just says, whatever happens to me, because I have no control over things that happen to me. I do not have the power to exercise control over whom I sleep with, over whether or not I take some kind of contraceptive, over whether or not I seek out abortion or abortive services, right? And I notice this when women of all races and ethnicities, if their class and how they were socialized in their upbringing was that of just, well, whatever happens to you in life just happens. You know what I mean? You're supposed to take it to the chin, chin up and just deal with it. This is your fault and your responsibility. As opposed to women who are socialized in a class that says, hey, you have control over this. You don't have to tolerate or put up with anything that you don't want to do. This is your life. This is your body. You don't have to do anything that you don't want to do. Do you see what I mean? Do you see the difference in the dynamic here? And please forgive me if I'm talking in circles, because I really tried. I tried typing up a script for this episode like I normally do and having all my notes and my stats and facts, and it's a little different than how I normally do it, but the sociologist in me just loves coming up with theories to explain the world around me, okay? So what I'm saying is that more than her race, more than her ethnicity, more than even her religion, more than the zip code that she grew up in, a woman's class, the sets of beliefs and values that are instilled in her, impact her approach to reproductive decisions more than her college education does, more than her income in adulthood does, more than where she lives or where she works or what her profession in adulthood is. Because if she's socialized in youth, if she's socialized in adolescence to not believe that she has power within herself to make decisions for herself that impact her and her life and her outcome and her body, then when she reaches adulthood, no amount of college education, no amount of high income, no amount of highfalutin corporate job title or position is going to undo the class indoctrination that she received in her upbringing, right? So I can use myself as an example. I love using examples because I understand what I'm saying. It may be just a little difficult to digest. I am a mixed race woman, right? So I'm a mixed race Black woman. My family is Jamaican, so we are foreigners. I was born abroad in Jamaica and moved to the States when I was 5 years old and became a naturalized U.S. citizen. So America is my home. Although my nationality is technically Jamaican, I'm a former immigrant because I'm a U.S. citizen now. I had to rescind my Jamaican nationality to become a U.S. citizen. So I'm an American woman. My upbringing, that I observed, the way that my mom socialized me and the way that I was socialized in my family, in the settings that made up my developmental years and my adolescent years, reinforced that I have control over my life. If I want something, I reach out and I take it. I have control to plan and to strategize and to plot my way to achieving my goals and my dreams and my objectives, because they're mine to have, they're mine to achieve. So within that, then, I also have control. I also have say in whom I date. I also have say in whom I go out with. I also have say in whether or not I want to have a child. So my approach to being child-free and motherhood in general is that it's something I will do when I want to, right? It's not something that I shrug my shoulders and, okay, it'll happen when it happens, or I guess it happened. Oops, I'm surprised. I turned up pregnant. Oh my gosh. No, my socialization, my class, my definition of class was that I have the power. I have the say over whether or not those things happen to me. And I have the power to exercise the agency and determining when or if I experience motherhood or unwanted pregnancy. So I have the power to walk into a doctor's office and discuss my options for birth control and take birth control to prevent unwanted pregnancy while I'm dating or while I'm hooking up, or in the event, God forbid, that I'm assaulted or something like that, because I have the agency to do that. That's my decision to make. It's not something that is just going to happen to me because, oh, I can't believe it. Oh my gosh, I'm a woman of childbearing age with no reproductive issues, having unprotected sex with a WAN of childbearing age. I can't believe I'm pregnant. How did that happen? Not my approach. It's very strategic. And why I have that approach, why I have that mindset, is because of how my upbringing was, because of the environment that I was socialized in. The values and the beliefs that were instilled in me were that I have the control. I have the power. I have the say. It is my body, my choice. That's not an exaggeration. That's not just a plucky political slogan that politicians use when they're campaigning. It's a fact for me. Do you see what I mean? So I say, that's my response to whenever I see women kind of pushing back on child-free women when they say things like, oh, well, just wait till life happens to you. You know, you say it could never happen to you. It could never be you. No, it really could never be me. I say that and I mean that. I stand 10 toes down on that, as the young people say, as I sit here as a 32-year-old young person myself. But no, it could not be me because I control it. Like, I have the autonomy to control that, right? Like, the class that I was socialized in tells me I determine who comes into my life and who walks out of my life. I don't have to sleep with anyone I don't want to sleep with. And I also don't have to get pregnant every single time that I have sex with a man. Why? Because we have medical technology and rights and privileges now that say that I don't have to if I don't want to. So I access those things. I seek those resources out. That's another thing. Is that class, my definition of class being the set of values and beliefs that are instilled upon you during your developmental formative years in your particular social setting, regardless of your race, ethnicity, or your income in that social setting, is that, like, I have the say in whether or not I keep, whether or not I want to terminate a pregnancy, whether or not I want to seek out an abortion, right? It's something that I can control, right? So if it's something I can control, then there are resources and there are materials and educational things out there that I can seek out to prevent pregnancy, to prevent unwanted pregnancy specifically, and to prevent STDs and STIs. So again, using another example, something that's very concerning that I hear a lot of young women say are like, you know, these awful misconceptions, a lot of misinformation surrounding birth control. Well, I heard it was bad for you, and I heard it does all these things to your body, and it's not really good for you, and these things. And it's so indicative of the particular social setting that they were raised in or grew up in, that they believe that a form of contraception that has existed for over 60 years and has been vetted by every single medical establishment. The finest medical minds in the world have vetted all the different kinds of contraception that are available to women today, especially in more developed countries like the United States. I hear these young women say things like that birth control has all these negative side effects, and they never have that approach towards things like single motherhood. You see what I mean? So they'd rather risk single motherhood and the poverty that could come with that, as I've discussed in prior episodes, the Black maternal health crisis, the feminization of poverty, period poverty. They're more concerned with these rumors that they hear and absolutely believe about contraception more than they're concerned with potentially exposing themselves and a child to a lifetime of uncertainty and poverty and all of the social issues that come with that. That's concerning, and that's indicative of their class. And that class sticks with them even as they navigate different social statuses throughout their lives. So they will hold those beliefs and hold that misinformation about things like contraception and abortion, even as they become college educated, even as they navigate and move into formal, more corporate professional spaces where other people are college educated and supposedly enlightened and well-read. They'll still hold on to those beliefs. They'll still, well, I wasn't on birth control, so I got pregnant. Okay, and you kept the baby? You kept the pregnancy? You just let these things happen to you? Because their class, their upbringing, the values and the beliefs that they're taught about themselves are that they do not have the power to exercise control over those kinds of very important reproductive decisions. They don't have the power to reach out and stop these things from happening. My personal philosophy has always been prevention is better than the cure, especially when it comes to being a cisgender heterosexual woman who could get pregnant, because I am the woman. Every single time I lay down with a man who's relatively healthy and of childbearing age, I run the risk of unwanted pregnancy. I don't want to be pregnant because I don't want to be pregnant. I don't want to have children. So I do things to prevent that from happening, as opposed to waiting until it happens and then resigning myself to my fate, so to speak, right? No, I take the steps to prevent that. But why do I do that? because of my class, the class that I was brought up in specifically. I was getting into earlier, and then kind of my train of thought escaped me. I'm a mixed race Jamaican woman, and my class, social settings that I was raised in, thanks to the ongoing efforts and hard labor of my mom, taught me that I have control over certain things. Now, was that absolutely influenced by the fact that I was born into an upper middle class family? Yes. Right? There are studies and lots of published literature and work that demonstrates that children born and brought up in middle class and higher and upper middle class and upper class environments tend to have they tend to have more confidence, or they tend to believe that they have more control over their lives. They don't kind of resign themselves to whatever. They tend to seek out more opportunity because they're brought up to believe they have options, as opposed to children brought up in more working class or poor environments who don't believe or view themselves as in control of their own lives, right? So, of course, me being born into an upper middle class family where we had a housekeeper and things like that. My father was someone who didn't really have to work. He lived off of inheritances from his family because his family was part of the mixed race, landed gentry in rural Jamaica, right? So, and my mom, who is a light-skinned mixed race woman herself, and unfortunately in Jamaica, colorism is almost stronger than classism. She married my father, and there we were. Do you see what I mean? So, of course, it's easy for me to say I believe in my power and my agency because that's the environment I was brought up in. I grew up with a housekeeper. I grew up with a nanny. I grew up seeing, we had groundskeepers and things like that. I had people driving me to and from school. And even after we moved to the United States, although we weren't upper middle class, we were still very solidly middle class, living in suburban central Florida in the late 90s and the early 2000s, right? So that environment, where I'm surrounded by people who are like-minded, and the other kids in school had parents who were college educated and also middle class and solidly middle class in terms of values and income and zip code and all of that. So it's easy for me to say these things. So I understand that I have certain privileges that impact and influence my viewpoint on this theory. For a woman now who is born into a poorer or working class environment where resources were scarce and opportunities were few and far between, her approach to her own reproductive decisions are absolutely going to be influenced by the fact that she didn't have a lot of options in her childhood. She didn't see the people around her, the adults in her life or other children in her life, have the agency to exercise certain options because things were always tight. Resources, food, water, money, housing, clothing, basic necessities needed to survival were always in short supply. That absolutely is going to influence her approach to her own body and her own reproductive decisions and choices, even if that woman navigates out of that poor working class upbringing through virtue of education or profession or skill or something, or she becomes a celebrity or she becomes a beautician, whatever it is. What I'm getting at is that regardless of what education or what income the woman ultimately ends up earning, it does not change her class and the class that she was brought up in, the class that she was socialized within. Because the class that she was socialized within, the values and the beliefs she was taught to have, how she was taught to view herself, how she was taught to view the world around her, is a far greater indicator of how she will approach reproductive choices and decisions. It's a greater indicator than I think race, ethnicity, income, educational level, zip code, geographic location, etc. Personally, and again, some examples or some proof that my theory isn't so far off is every time we see it, we see it in the news, we see these stories that trend on social media about a woman who is like a vice president at a bank, or she's a director at an organization. She's a manager. She's college educated. She socializes with well-to-do individuals. And then you look at her romantic partner and you're like, girl, where did you even find him? No, literally, where did you find him? Because he's not in your social circles. You had to seek this man out to go find him. And then you look at her pregnant for this person and it's like, you don't have to do that, right? You have options, even, okay, well, religiously, I don't believe in abortion. Okay, it's absolutely your right to choose. The emphasis is on the right to choose, not that you have to choose one particular way, right? But understand what you're getting into and understand why you have that right to choose in the first place. Because things like the feminization of poverty exist. And the feminization of poverty, as I've previously discussed, tells us that a woman, the minute she has a child, regardless of whether or not she's married, regardless of how much money she or her spouse or the child's father makes, having a child immediately doubles her chances of entering into poverty, just like that. Like no other factors considered. The minute she's pregnant and has a child, a woman automatically doubles her chances of being impoverished. That's how serious pregnancy is, right? So when you look at these powerful women, you're like, you have options, sis. You have choices. You don't want to exercise those options? You mean you exercise those options and you exercise that power when it was time to pursue your education, or when it was time to pursue your skill, when it was time to pursue your entrepreneurial goals and dreams. But all of that agency, all of that power and that decision making just vanishes when a male person walks into your life. Of course, there could be other factors that influence this. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm not including the unfortunate things like intimate partner abuse and domestic violence. I'm simply I'm looking solely at the woman in the relationship, and I'm not looking at her male partner in this instance, right? So I'm not discussing reproductive abuse. That's a separate discussion. And maybe that's another episode subject. Ideas. No, I'm looking at the woman herself. And I'm saying that how she was socialized in her upbringing, in her developmental years, ages 0 through roughly 19, those very important, crucial, formative years, that those values and beliefs that are instilled in her during that time are what determine almost for the rest of her life how she approaches reproductive decisions. And that those values and beliefs towards reproductive decision making stay the same throughout her life, rather than changing as she obtains higher education, as she obtains higher income, as she obtains moving into a nicer zip code, as she obtains even socializing with men who are on par with her in terms of education and income and job title and status and all of that stuff. That's what I'm saying. And I think this impact of class is almost a blind spot in all of our discussions about reproductive justice and all of our discussions about reproductive rights. It is definitely a blind spot, and it's one that I didn't clock myself until my mom pointed it out. Shout out to my mom, Harriet Kemmock, love her down, who's another woman's advocate, and she's my best friend, my biggest supporter, my biggest cheerleader. Also shout out to my little sister, Anna Lisa. Okay, the OG Cancer. She loves being a Cancer. And she's a senior at Michigan State now. Woo, go green. And she's graduating soon. Individually, they've each pointed these things out to me in terms of how women approach their reproductive decisions, right? And in separate instances with like maybe my sister's friend groups, or with my mom who has friends who have children my age and my sister's age. My sister's in her early 20s. You know what I mean? That's how I came to this observation, right? So it also explains, why even now as a woman who, although I'm very highly educated, I have a law degree, my income hasn't necessarily put me in upper middle class settings just yet. And that's okay. We'll get there when we get there. I work in nonprofit settings now because I want to help the people and help women, right? Even though my income doesn't reflect my education, because I was socialized in my upbringing to believe that I have the power and control over my decision-making process, that socialization has stayed with me even as I've moved up and down certain social classes with respect to income, with respect to job titles that I've held, with respect to places where I've worked, with respect to zip codes where I've lived, right? Even though I'm technically like working class right now, well, lower middle class, I will say, because working class are folks who are not college educated, technically. Even though I'm lower middle class right now, because I was socialized in my upbringing to have certain values and beliefs about my body and my choices, even as a technically lower middle class person right now, I still retain that socialization, right? So that's why women who are socialized in particular settings with certain values and beliefs retain that socialization as well. The socialization that tells them that they kind of are resigned to their fate as women. They don't have any power to, Lord, they don't have any power to exercise their agency, to exercise, like to actually act on the rights that we have. It's one thing to have the rights thanks to legislation and advocacy. It's another thing to act on that right. So, for example, we have student loans, federal student loans that fund college degrees. It's up to an individual person still to apply to college, go through the motions, pass your classes, and meet the requirements and graduate with a degree. That's how it is with women, right? The rights are there. The autonomy is there. The protections, the legal protections are there. And I will fight until my last dying breath to make sure that they stay there, okay? And regardless of who is in office, right? But it's women who are not socialized to reach out and utilize and act on those freedoms and rights. Well, they're going to have certain approaches to their reproductive decisions. They're going to say that, well, if you get pregnant, you get pregnant. Oh, well, nothing else you can do about it. Nothing you can do to stop it. Nothing you can do to prevent that. It is what it is. So if you're a girly pop and that's your approach, or if you are someone who has a lot of this misinformation or these really outdated or sort of beliefs about contraception that are not based in fact, I would advise you to do your research. And when I say do your research, I don't mean go on Google and then find yourself in certain chat rooms or online spaces that just spew conspiracy theories and you find yourself talking to people who drink raw milk and whatnot. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about contact a medical professional. Okay. I'm talking about seeking out medical advice from licensed medical credentialed individuals who are authorities on this and who have say in this. Okay. And yes, I understand, I'm ignoring the fact that not every woman has access to contraception because healthcare in this country is a fucking joke. I understand that. And I understand not every woman has access to transportation, to drive herself to a doctor, to pay for a doctor's visit, to even drive herself to a Planned Parenthood. She may live in a Republican red state that doesn't have pro-choice measures in place, or she may live somewhere that's rural where she doesn't have transportation, or she may live somewhere that's so rural, internet connection is spotty. I absolutely understand that. And I understand that I have a lot of privilege, not only being college educated, but living in a blue state, like the state of Michigan, and living in a large urban city like Detroit, where access to internet and even transportation are not as hard. So I have my own car. If I didn't have my own car, there is a bus system in Detroit. It sucks, but there is a bus system. It's also a major urban city. So things like Uber and Lyft exist, right? As do plenty of doctors' offices and Planned Parenthoods and clinics and things like that. And I also have widespread access to the internet. So I understand I say these things and from a very privileged point of view. So I want you to keep that in mind too when when you're thinking over my theory, okay, and you're thinking on it and you're thinking about how my theory impacts your life. My theory, again, being that the class that a woman is socialized in her developmental formative years is really what determines her approach to reproductive decisions and choices, more so than her race, her ethnicity, her geographic location, her level of college education, her income, and where she lives, etc. That's what I'm saying. So read up on it. Something that I am also reading right now, because one of my New Year's resolutions is to be more disciplined with my education. Although I have my law degree, it's still important to continue re-educating myself on the things I love to talk about, specifically women's rights and women's wrongs. So to that end, I'm actually reading right now Men Who Hate Women by Laura Bates, I believe it is. I can actually check my Kindle app right now because I got my handy dandy iPad. But I'm reading it right now, and I've just started reading it, and it's quite the journey. With things like this. Men Who Hate Women by Laura Bates. Men Who Hate Women by Laura Bates. With things like this and reading the, more academic approaches to things like misogyny and misogynoir and sexism, it's one of those things that once you see, you cannot unsee. Once you know it, you cannot unknow it. It's opening Pandora's box. There's no going back. So it's an excellent read thus far. I 10 out of 10 recommend it thus far. I'm only about 50 pages or so in. But I would strongly advise to go into reading it with the understanding and the acceptance that you will never view the men around you the same ever again. And that's a good thing. Me thinks that's a good thing. Okay. Well, this has been yet another episode of Alexandra Unfiltered. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I really enjoy your company. I really enjoy the fact that you listen to me and my yapping. I'm a certified yapper. I really enjoy that. Go ahead and head over to my YouTube page, Alexandra Rose Unfiltered, where I have videos of my recent podcast episodes. You can find this podcast wherever you stream your podcasts from, including but not limited to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, so on and so forth. I'm also on Instagram, Alex_Rose_M. I'm on TikTok, this new version of TikTok where I'm not getting a lot of views, so please holla at your girl. Follow me there, AlexRoseM_. I'm also on RedNote as well, the new Chinese app. Well, not new, but I'm on there as well, Alexandra Rose Unfiltered. And I really look forward to talking to you next week about another topic that will discuss women's rights, women's wrongs, and everything in between. Again, thank you so much for tuning in. This is your fave bad bee with a law degree, Alexandra Rose, signing off. Bye-bye.